As a first step of the process, first step here though, I imagine that many of you probably haven't been through a sale process or a purchase process before, so to provide some context, I'm just going to very quickly run through a typical competitive sale process. So the next two slides, I've split this process up into 15 different parts. The first and second stage, these could actually be flipped around, but the first stage I've got down is pre-sale analysis of the business, and this is with your own advisors. It's often called vendor due diligence, and in it you will look at the market, try and identify some potential purchasers, and where needed, and it usually is, tidy up businesses for the sale. Second, a sale agent or advisor is appointed. Yes, this will usually be a business broker or an accounting firm. The information memorandum is an important part of the process. Typically this will be prepared by the sale advisor, but obviously with an owner's input. Number 4, contact potential purchasers. This is an interesting one. I've got also down there general marketing. A lot of businesses actually sold without general marketing. In the earlier stages, you'll identify a purchaser and it'll be one-on-one. And obviously that's a far better way of managing a sale process where you want to keep the process confidential. Number 5, expressions of interest are called for. This is the long list, and clearly if you're a seller, the longer the better. NDA, the non-disclosure agreement, is completed by selected parties. This is the shortlist, and then an IM will be circulated. Step 8, indicative bids are received, hopefully. And step 9, the preferred party or parties, plural, are selected. Then you really get into the crunch of the process. The high-level due diligence will start. That will often be supplemented by a Q&A process driven by potential purchasers. And that will lead to confirmed bids, which will outline the bid conditions. Next step, the preferred bidder is selected, and the heavy legal process really starts at this point. Sale agreement is negotiated and signed, hopefully, and then you work through a conditional phase where generally a purchaser will work through its conditions, such as due diligence, finance. There might be assignment of some key agreements, contractors, etc., transfer of employees, and all going well, those conditions will be confirmed and settlement occurs. The process can vary a lot though. This is a typical competitive process where you're wanting to bring in a number of parties who are competing for as long as possible throughout the process. Many times, however, a private deal will be done. You'll know, your business owner, you'll know who the most logical buyer or likely buyer of your business is, and you may have already talked about it in the past and you'll just do a deal. The other scenario we see a bit is the unsolicited offer from a purchaser. This is the white knight who rides across the horizon with a pot of money that's too good to turn away. So some deal examples. I've got 5 deal examples here, and as I said, these are actual deals that we've been involved in. They were lumpy at times, and you'll see why in a minute. No names will be mentioned to protect the guilty. So the first one was the sale of a solar heating business. This business was involved in the supply of solar heating panels and related equipment, and it also did some installation. There was an IM, but it was very light on asset details and values. It rotated me at the time because we were asked by the vendor or the agent to prepare a sale and purchase agreement on a pretty poor IM, and without having done any due diligence. So we didn't really know what we were actually buying, but nonetheless we were required to sign an agreement to buy it. So we got through that hurdle with a number of conditions in the agreement, and then started looking at the business. The stock management was a shambles. There was a huge amount of excess and obsolete stock, and really no purchaser would have committed to buy all of the stock. A number of things didn't stack up. The stock turn was very low. There were many years of supply for some stock keeping units, and there was a high obsolescence risk. You can imagine with solar panels, one comes out next year and 50 or 100 you've got in the warehouse are no longer of any value. As a consequence of this, the normalised earnings was, and the fair price was very hard to determine. These were all raised with the vendor, and their proposal was that they would retain the excess stock and sell it on Trade Me, which would obviously mean that the vendor would be competing with the purchaser in the market after we'd bought the business. So not surprisingly, that deal terminated. There were significant costs incurred by our client, the unsuccessful purchaser, and needless to say, it didn't reflect well on the vendor, and I'm not even sure if that business was ever able to be sold. Deal 2. Wholesale supplier of an apparel range, multiple brands. We were acting for the purchaser of this property, and in fact I settled it yesterday. So it was an established business with reliable retail channels in New Zealand and Australia, and into which this apparel range or ranges were sold. Interestingly, the vendor did not have any trademark protection for the brands. They were selling the brands, but they weren't protected. What was worse was that there were other third-party trademarks already registered, which prevented those brands from being registered. So it was a real clunker. We clearly had a difficult IP issue to resolve, and it was going to be very time-consuming. And for many, for many purchasers, it would have simply been a deal breaker. As I said, our purchaser did do the deal, but it required new branding to be adopted after some due diligence about trademarks that were available. That required consultation with the downstream customers, the retailers, to make sure that they were happy with it. And obviously there's a significant cost issue. Who's going to pay the cost of developing the actual brands and registering them, and there's a time factor there as well. So I'm sure Corinne from AJ Park, when she speaks, will say that it's never a good look to come to the market with your business if you don't have protection for your brands, and it's even worse if your brands are competing or breaching the trademarks which are owned by others. So go back to that first step in the sale process. Look at your business, do your vendor due diligence, solve the issues before they're raised. Deal 3, wholesale supplier of protective workwear. So look, this is the part 1 of my story about earnouts. This was a very successful and profitable business. It was diversifying, and it had strong growth path tracked out. There were divergent views by the vendor and purchaser on future earnings growth, and so it was difficult to specify a purchase price. After a lot of arm wrestling and other things, a complex earnout was ultimately agreed. And basically what that meant was that the vendor agreed to sell with a lower price than they liked, but the upside was that additional purchase price would be paid if agreed profit targets were made or achieved after settlement. However, the only thing that is constant in business is change. It's already been mentioned tonight, particularly by Tony. No one really saw this one coming, however, because not long after settlement, a key supplier to the business was unfortunately killed in a car crash, and the supply channel basically ended overnight, and it took some time to resurrect it. So no surprise, the profit targets were not achieved and no earn-out was paid. Certainly not a good outcome for the vendor, although to be fair, probably the same death event would have occurred if they continued in the business as well. Deal 4, second story about earn-outs. This is a manufacturer, a supplier of aftermarket vehicle accessories. Again, a really good business, very profitable, solid track record, but the parties couldn't agree on a sale price, and so we had a pain share, gain share earn-out arrangement agreed. In this one, the purchaser actually achieved the profit levels, but refused to pay the earn-out because of some other issues that they believed had arisen in the business after settlement. So they claimed a set-off for their losses or damages as they saw them. So we had a costly dispute. Great for the lawyers. No, not for anybody else. The purchaser was fairly bullish. They really assumed the position's 9/10 of the law position. They had the business and they had the cash, and it was going to be very difficult to get it from them. Litigation would have been very costly and drawn out, and the ultimate outcome of that was that no one really won. Last deal I'm going to talk about, before talking about themes and golden rules, is what I've called the Ladders and the Commerce Commission deal. So here, the vendor and purchaser were competitors in a specialist sector of the height access market. Our client, the purchaser, was dominant in that market, and the vendor was struggling and wanted to, or probably needed to, sell and exit, otherwise it was going to close down. So our client bought the business for a relatively low value, and 2 months after settlement, the Commerce Commission wrote us a letter. They wanted to investigate whether the acquisition substantially lessened competition in that market. Everyone got a little bit nervy, because what had happened, the consequence of the deal is that there was a merger of the two biggest players in the market, notwithstanding the second one was really failing. Interestingly, this started by an anonymous tip-off to the Commerce Commission, which is not unusual. It was probably a customer who could no longer get two competitor quotes, and they were a bit peeved about that. Probably felt like the one quote that they could get was going to be loaded. So a detailed investigation ensued. The Commerce Commission ultimately was satisfied that there was no breach of the relevant acquisition rule, but it was a very costly and distracting process in a very important stage of the sale transaction, which is the period immediately following settlement, when you're trying to establish relationships with customers and suppliers and staff, etc. Also, it's a period of high anxiety for the parties. If we fell on the wrong side of the line, our client who bought, they could have been required to divest the business, and the maximum fine is $5 million, and that's the sort of money that keeps people awake at night. Just as an interesting aside, if our client hadn't bought and the business had failed, shut down, even if we picked up some employees just because they had no jobs, there would have been no issues in terms of the Commerce Act because there hadn't been an acquisition. So, turning on to the common themes, who is the best purchaser? And this this overlay with the regulatory regime. This should be investigated in step one of that process that I put up early on. The Commerce Act does say that acquisitions that seem substantially less than competition in a market are prohibited. And for the people in this room, you probably think, well, it doesn't apply to us, but this rule can trip up relatively small to medium-sized businesses. It's not just the airlines and the telcos and the energy companies that struggle with this one. Part of the reason for that is that the relevant markets can be very narrow. They'll be assessed at a sector level, whether you're a wholesaler or a retailer, at a product level, and they'll also look at geographic areas. And the market may not necessarily be the market in New Zealand. If there are geographic barriers, there could be several in the North Island, there could be several in the South Island. So the kind of the theme here is you need to be sure that you don't become a victim of your own success. A 3-to-2 merger, that is where you've got 3 key competitors and one sells to another, or where number 1 sells to number 2, or vice versa, when many other competitors exist, may breach the Act and may not be possible. So although you've got a great business, there might be real impediments in terms of how you can sell it, and you may need to consider consider some other options, some of which have just been mentioned. The management buy-in, which could be staged over years. Other options are to focus on a sale to an overseas party, try and find an Australian business in the same area who wants to diversify into the New Zealand market, or sell to a new entrant, try and convince someone that they've got the skills to take the business on and structure it so that you'll assist them to do that. Manage your stock. So this is that Deal 1 fiasco. Stock issues are very common in the deals that we see, and the difficulty with them is that you've gone through a number of stages of the process, you're highly invested, and they'll get raised right at the end in the due diligence process. Particularly the issue we see arises where you have excess or obsolete stock. You need to have a tidy balance sheet and stock ledger. If only because it's not only because it's best practice, but it's also critical for a purchaser to arrange finance. Lenders will not want to be loaning or providing finance to a business to buy a whole lot of lazy stock. A couple of other things about stock valuation. You need to use GAAP in your business's generally accepted accounting practice. That requires stock to be written off when it should be, and kind of the flip side of that is don't have your own valuation process. I had a transaction last year where the vendor was insistent that we use their process. No one could really understand it. We probably spent about 6 months trying to actually work through it and sort of refine it around the edges. It was a very, very difficult deal, and again, it didn't need to be. If you have an odd valuation process, a purchaser is going to want to normalise it. That will have an effect on your earnings that you're presenting to them, and obviously any fall in profit that results is going to lead to a reduction in the purchase price. So number 3, protect your intellectual property. This was a key issue from that second deal. Sale prices are typically a multiple of future earnings, and brands are clearly critical. If you don't protect your brands, or if others are able to use them, there is a risk to future sales, and that's obviously value eroding. If you don't have trademark protection and others are breaching your trademarks, it's probably going to be a deal breaker, or at the very least, there's there's going to be a large price carve, and you can join the dots in terms of that transaction yesterday on that one. Cash is king. So this is the bird in the hand mantra. Earn-outs are complex and breach one of my golden rules, which is the vendor's risk should end on the settlement date. They do serve a purpose, but if a purchaser doesn't see value upside from investment or new initiatives which have been put in place prior to settlement by the current owner, it may be better for that owner just to continue to roll out those initiatives until the earnings and the value can be proven, then go back to the market. The other big thing about earn-outs is that the vendor is exposed to purchaser mismanagement of the business transition process. They will have very little say as to how the purchaser runs the business. Unlikely there will be some significant changes. Customers and staff and suppliers may not be happy about it. It's risky. So, fifth golden rule, keep it simple. Avoid complexity. There needs to be a clear demarcation of risk and reward in any transaction. The rule of thumb is the vendor has the risk and the reward before settlement. The purchaser needs to assume it after settlement. You don't want to be in a situation where the vendor is at risk but gets nothing for it because this is after settlement, because the profits of the business will be retained by the purchaser. Only hindsight provides 20/20 vision around the complexity you need and you don't. But I think a couple of sort of observations. The most complex and detailed drafting and sale agreements and other arrangements on a business transaction, they won't cover all points. In Deal 4, there was no carve out for a death in the supply chain. It sounds like a movie title, doesn't it? No one foresaw that. No one could negotiate that. No one could put something realistically in an agreement that would cover that. Complexity also adds costs. It delays the deal significantly, and that any delays give the purchaser the opportunity to kind of think too long and possibly walk away. I think the other thing about this is that also, with complexity, you're only often arguing academic points which commercially don't really mean that much, and they're probably only of interest to lawyers or other advisors. So, those sort of points were really more specific to those transactions that I talked about. I'm now just going to cover off 10 golden rules. This is the kind of stuff that lawyers put on their walls, or emailing ones anyway. So, number one, prepare your business for sale. I'm sure you're going to hear this theme a number of times today. Do your vendor due diligence in step one. Get your professional advisors to review the business. They'll identify issues that are going to be likely raised by a purchaser in their due diligence phase. It's critical that you go to the market with a clean business and that you tidy up loose ends before we start talking to purchasers. You need to review things like your leases, supply contracts, distribution agreements, franchise agreements, licenses, customer contracts, employment agreements, anything which is critical to your business. All of these contracts, arrangements, they need to be signed and they need to be up to date. We don't want to sort of see the one that was signed up 10 years ago but something else has happened and the document hasn't been varied or updated. They also need to be legally compliant. Changes in employment law, for example. A lot of times we see employment agreements which are not currently compliant with current laws. The objective here is to avoid issues being dealt with in the late stage during the purchaser's due diligence. That was step 14, it's right at the end. That can often lead to a last minute renegotiation or reduction in price. Beware, many purchasers are looking for that. They will instruct their advisors to find the problems so that they can raise them at the last minute and get a 5%, 10% reduction in the sale price. The vendor, you will be very wary of the process. You're going to spend a lot of money, and it's going to be easy for them to find the soft underbelly. So the far better thing to do is just deal with it up front. Golden rule number 2, run a competitive process. Your objective is to make it a seller's market. Competition, or the assumption that there is competition, invariably leads to the best outcome for a vendor. I've been involved in a number of transactions where a competitive process has been run, and without wanting to mislead anybody, the assumption has been made that some of the other competitors might be in there and there's a multi-party transaction going on. Clearly that's the objective, but the perception of that being the case is also very valuable to a vendor in terms of getting the right outcome. Contestability also solves a lot of problems. If those DD issues are raised late in the piece, often a purchaser will just walk away, or not walk away, but they won't pursue them because they don't want to lose a deal to who they may think is one of their own competitors. They want to be the one that buys, not their guy down the road. Number 3, present a professional information memorandum. Don't do your own IM. You're all good at running your businesses. Get someone who's really good at doing IMs to prepare the IM. Obviously, you'll have a lot of input into that, but there's some really good templates out there, and you need to provide the right stuff, and you need to exclude the stuff that's not important. I've never really seen a really good homegrown IM, and I've seen some appalling ones. And of course, the objective is to attract purchasers, not turn them away. So use the experts. They will be able to independently review content and provide credibility. And also, it's probably not apparent to many of you, but an IM will also provide normalised earnings summaries. So it provides an opportunity for your advisors to remove one-offs. For example, if you've in the previous financial year, if you've had a PG claim, or you've invested a lot in a new product launch, then you can normalise the P&L and strip those things out on the basis that those line items, those costs won't be relevant to a business going forward. That will increase your earnings and should increase your purchase price. Did I mention that you should not do your own IM? I think I did. This is a really important one. Don't give away the secret recipe. Often you'll be doing a trade sale, you'll be selling to a competitor, and we've seen numerous instances where competitors have participated in a sale process, not because they're going to buy the business, but because they want to get some information about your business, and they want to secretly use it for their own advantage. And this is despite the fact that they will have signed a non-disclosure agreement. Kind of once it's out there, it's out there. So the type of sensitive information that you should retain for as long as possible, your supply prices, your customer names, your margins, many of these things can be aggregated, or names can be moved, customer 1, customer 2, etc. Retain the most sensitive information right to the end of the DD process. If the purchaser knows what the sales are, it knows what the expenses are, it knows what the profit is, do they really need to know some of the fine detail, in between to make a decision to buy or not? I've been involved in transactions where the most sensitive information has never been given to a purchaser and is only provided when the money is handed over on settlement. If that's where you're going to be, you should outline that early in the process, and at least it's not a surprise to a purchaser when that's what I'll see later on. Rule 5, document the sale well. All businesses are different. There's no standard form, and the buyer and seller typically want different outcomes. One of the key things I'd say to you here is try and prepare a sale agreement. The phrase we use, the drafter is the crafter. If you do the first draft, whether you're selling or buying, you can get 100% of what you want in the contract. If it comes from someone else, it's very much harder to put your stuff in it. It's just the way that the contract negotiation process works. Number 6, don't assume post-settlement risk. Warranties should relate to the period prior to settlement only, never underwrite future performance, and if you're providing forecasts, whether it's in your due diligence material or in the agreement itself, they should always present it as a best estimate. The aim for you, if you're selling your business, is to get the money and to keep the money, rather than obviously being subject to claims. Use good advisors. Now, this is self-serving, I know, assuming I'm a good advisor. Use advisors that are experts in selling and buying businesses. But I think the more important factor is that use advisors who are commercial. Advisors who don't know what they're doing or who are just going to point score throughout the process can make deals very difficult, and in some instances can actually kill them. Your general advisor that you use for everything is probably not the person you want to use for an M&A transaction. And specialist tax advice is usually always needed. Rule 8, use your leverage. Part of this is about keeping the process competitive for as long as possible, but also consider timing. Consider using timing to your advantage. If your business is seasonal, try and settle, work backwards so that you're settling before the start of the next season, because that'll be a driver for the purchaser to make decisions, get the deal done, rather than sort of start to lose revenue because the peak season has started. The end of year deadline, Christmas, is also another good one, but we hate this as advisors because we typically get loaded up. But it's a good way to shrink a transaction time frame and get a deal done. Leverage I've got under here, as part of your leverage, be prepared to call your bluff. Kind of when you watch suits. It should be compulsory legal training for a deal person really. But be prepared to call their bluff. Most issues raised by a purchaser which they say are deal breakers are not really deal breakers. They're invested in the process as well, and kind of need to sort of say, oh really, and steer them out. A couple more quick ones. Avoid the false economies trap. Invest up front to tidy your business. That's step 1. Engage the experts. Avoid the DIY approach. Unless you're experienced in doing business transactions. The payback from this investment can be significant. First step might be the difference between getting a business sold and not. But also, the extra purchase price that you can get, or the reduction in purchase price that you can avoid from doing your home and having good people around you and presenting them with a clean business can be significant. And lastly, avoid deal fatigue. Most business owners don't have any spare time during their day, and I see so many times business owners underestimate the distraction that is caused to the business during the sale process. If you can have additional resource available, grab it. Business as usual, day-to-day stuff. Be commercial, and the final comment I've got there is that a good deal is a fast deal, usually. So I think I've had time for questions.
No, that's great. Thank you, David. And we'll just open the floor to questions for David. If anybody's got anything they want to ask him with regard to the legal side of putting a deal together.
David, you say a good deal's a fast deal. Typically, how long is a deal with a piece of string?
Remember that thing I said about all the deals are different? Look, for an SME business, 2 to 3 months is kind of okay. I'm going to see a client this afternoon whose business though it took 14 months to do. So it really depends on so many factors. But if you kind of front load it, you do all the prep work, you have good advisors, you run a tight process, 2 to 3 months. We can do it in 2 weeks as well. If there's a real drive for people being commercial, but it does depend a lot on the business itself and the issues that they have to navigate.
You mentioned earnings ratios. What sort of guidance? How much are they doing?
Well, I think PwC speaking later on, they're probably better to answer that one. I won't go there. It varies again so much. As a question, the earnings ratio is all about the confidence that a purchaser can get that those current earnings or more can be achieved in future years. So if there's risk, the ratio will be low. If there's very stable earnings, diversified income streams, the earnings multiple can be a lot higher.
David, one of the key assets of a business, if not the biggest asset of a business, is the staff and the management system. And for the purchaser to continue to be successful, having that management structure and those staff transfer with the business is quite critical. So is there, if I'm a business vendor, should I be incentivizing my management team to stay on board to fulfill the future operations of the business with a purchaser?
That's a very good question. That's my one. We probably see something like that at 10% of our transactions. If you're an owner-occupier and you are selling and kind of retiring, semi-retiring, the purchaser is going to be concerned about transition, and it's critical that the next level of staff and management, people who know the business, transfer across. So it comes back to your question before, risk of getting those future earnings. It can be a very good idea to incentivise those key staff to transfer and be there for, say, 3 years or 4 years. And typically how you do that is that they would be paid a bonus. This can all be disclosed to a purchaser, it can be out in the open. It doesn't have to be, or shouldn't really be, that can be what the vendor does with the staff. And in fact, a purchaser might be quite happy to contribute to the bonus pool. It certainly helps get a deal done. It also prevents claims after the fact when the business hasn't gone as well because staff have left and other things have happened and they're just generally a bit grumpy.
And just another one, what's a reasonable non-competition period for restraining the vendor?
So you're selling your business. The expectation is that an offer for future earnings will be paid, and let's say it's 5 times earnings. Kind of the science of that would say that the vendor should agree that it won't complete for 5 years. It's going to give the purchaser the opportunity to earn back that 5 times earnings. However, that's probably, typically an SME business we would sort of see restraint periods of 3 to 5 years. The courts are probably never going to enforce a restraint longer than 5 years, even when you've been paid a considerable goodwill sum in your business exit. So that's the another factor you need to be aware of. You're going to be out of business. If you're selling the business, you're going to be out of the industry. Directly or indirectly for probably at least 3 to 5 years, basically.
So as a solicitor representing frequently the vendor, how important are the purchaser's advisors in terms of working with you as the vendor's representative, or in the mix of the transaction?
The quality of the advisors on both sides really is critical. I've been involved in a number of transactions that have failed and not have, the sell side advice on the buy side, but they failed because of poor, we would say, advisors on the other side. Advisors who are inexperienced or arrogant or point score on the way through the process who are not commercial can and often do kill a deal. It's certainly going to lead to a whole lot more transaction costs for the other side because you're constantly dealing with issues. In our office, we have a list of deal killers, and we quite regularly add to it. And when we have the opportunity to, for example, if you're in a contested process, one of the questions you need to ask from those bidders in their long list to get to the short list is, who are your advisors? Because your own advisors will know whether they're experienced and probably dealt with them. They're going to know whether they're going to be a deal enabler or a deal destroyer.
Or more?
Is there a typical amount of time the vendor would be asked to stay in the business as an advisor, and would there be a penalty versus reward for not fulfilling that advisory time frame?
Yeah, it's a good question again. A vendor owner operator. We kind of talked about the staff before, but a vendor owner operator may also need to be involved in the business after sale to get a deal done. Typical period. I'm just sort of going through some deals in my mind. We don't actually probably see it that often. Types of deals that we do in kind of the SME stage. I think the purchasers are confident enough that they can run the business. They will want to be able to have access to the vendor's brain, and that could go on for a period of time. And most vendors will be very, very happy to just sort of, within reason, just be permanently available. In terms of showing up at the premises after settlement, kind of 3 to 6 months, part-time, maybe sort of with reducing hours is not unusual. It's really whatever is required to get the purchaser to the point where they've got the confidence that they think the business can transition, and so that they buy.
Very good, thanks, David.